Hey, everybody. Welcome to the brand called you. So, listen, when I was in college, I'll never forget the first time I heard klezmer music, this haunting, soulful, beautiful Jewish music that felt like I had listened to it my whole life, and yet it was new to me. And that's why I am so incredibly excited to have our guest today, Walter Zev Feldman, who I like to call Zev, and so do his friends. And I will for the purposes of this interview. In many ways, he single-handedly, or almost single-handedly, spearheaded the revival of klezmer music, starting in the 1970s. It was really a relatively obscure and unknown form of traditional Jewish music until Zev came along. And we're going to hear his story about how he basically brought to life klezmer and the research surrounding it that he does. In case you can't picture it, I'm going to let you know that not only is he a klezmer musician and a dancer, he's also a brilliant thinker and academic who has written a plethora of books, including Music of the Ottoman Court, Klezmer, Music, History and Memory, from Rumi to the Whirling Dervishes, Music, Poetry, and Mysticism in the Ottoman Empire. He's written so many articles on a variety of subjects. But on top of that, he's also an authority in Ashkenazic dance, and he teaches it, he dances it, and perhaps most fascinating to me, he's now written about the role of gesture in the performing arts and its relationship to klezmer. So, Zev, welcome. It's like so thrilling to have you here.
Thank you very much.
The first thing I kept thinking about, after I first was exposed to klezmer in college, I was invited to an artist colony years later as a Jewish storyteller, and it's there where I first met the klezmatics. The first thing that seemed strange to me was as if I had heard this music before, even though I know I hadn't. And is there something in our genetic code that makes it both hauntingly familiar as well as new?
Well, I wouldn't speculate on genetic code, and actually, there are a couple in the world of the greatest klezmer performers who are not Jewish at all and never heard the music until their early adulthood. So, what can you say? What can we say about that? Yeah.
Well, you obviously got inspired by it due to your really interesting background. I know you mentioned that you had a Bessarabian father, but tell us a bit about your background and how it informed your passion and love of klezmer.
Well, I'm not sure I fully understand it myself, but I came from sort of an ethnic ghetto, so to speak, in the West Bronx, uh, where we had mostly Yiddish-speaking Jews, almost exclusively Jewish neighborhood. Our minority were Ladino-speaking Jews who came from
Mm.
Turkey and Greece. And I was also a member of their synagogue since I was 10 or 11 years old. I was the only Ashkenaz member. So, and I had many languages around me, Yiddish, Romanian, Russian, Turkish, so French too. So I began learning them all. And let's see, my father was a good dancer, right? And he came from a town, a shtetl, which is called Yedenetz. It's near the Hotin fortress in northern Moldova, which is also, that part is called Bessarabia. And it just so happened that that our family, as I learned later, our family had come there under the Turkish rule in the 18th century, where the Turks and the Greeks, who were their surrogates, then tried to encourage immigration of both Sephardi and Ashkenazi Jews into Moldova. And a lot of Jewish people who settled in the towns near the fortress were interacting with Greeks and Turks and Moldavians and so forth. And so uh, when I was young, I was brought to our Landsmannschaft, our regional organization, which was on the Lower East Side, where my father would be dancing. And on the radio, we heard very often the performance of the clarinetist Dave Taras. Taras was the most famous klezmer living after World War II, I think, pretty much in the States or anywhere else, actually. And it turns out he had performed from my father's Landsmannschaft because he studied also in our shtetl. And my father would be praising the musicians, of the shtetl. I didn't realize it wasn't just local patriotism. There was some reality behind it, that it had long been a center of musical interaction, very high level performance and composition. So Taras came from Ukraine to Yedinets, from Yedinets to New York, and developed his whole career performing and developing that style of that regional style of klezmer music, which then became a important basis of the American style of klezmer music.
For the people that might not know what klezmer is, can you kind of describe it musically? I mean, what?
Well, just historically, a klezmer in Yiddish was a member of the Jewish Musicians Guild, which meant it's a very close group of people. Often became hereditary, of klezmer lineages. Taras was from a klezmer lineage, of course. And it's developed first in Prague, in Bohemia in the Renaissance period, in the 16th century. And it was a time when Prague was a very good place for Jews to be. And this musical guild then spread from Bohemia into Poland, Lithuania, and all through the area of Eastern Europe where the Jews were living. And eventually down into Ottoman Moldova, in the 17th and 18th centuries. The music is basically one music. It's both listening music for weddings and dance music, right? And there is a broad difference between the style of the North and the style of the South, but these two styles have nothing to do with the local non-Jewish music. It's an internal Jewish dialogue, just like the word klezmer is used, the same word, from Lithuania down to Bessarabia, from the Baltic to the Black Sea, in other words. And in my estimation, in my work, in my book, Klezmer, Music, History, and Memory, what I think, not everybody may agree, but that our music has four fundamental elements in the klezmer repertoire. One is coming from the Ashkenazic prayer, from davening.
Wow.
That's very fundamental. That in many of our, what I call the core repertoire, we hear allusions to prayer.
You don't just mean in the words, you mean in the
There are no words. Our music is
words, yeah.
instrumental. There are no words.
So in the chords and the way it's sung.
Chords, modalities, melodic movements that anybody who was brought up, as we say in Yiddish, davening.
Yes.
Davening is the prayer, which I grew up with, of course, in our little shtibel. So I immediately recognized references to the general melodic movements. Okay, now this let's say liturgical allusion, these liturgical allusions then are mixed with elements coming from Renaissance dance music and Baroque dance and ceremonial music, because after all, we're speaking
a big polygon.
Well, but it's very artful. It's a tapestry. It's very artfully woven together. That again resembles no other music in the world. And then the fourth element is coming from Ottoman and Greek music of two social levels. One is coming more of a courtly level, dealing with the Ottoman mechterhane, the official music of the Ottoman state, which was heard everywhere in Eastern Europe. And in fact, maybe in the 18th century, there was a fashion for this music in many parts of Europe. And the klezmer musicians often were playing this music for Gentile aristocracies. This is documented in Bohemia and in Poland, and we even have an important manuscript from Berlin from the 18th century showing this. And then there's elements coming from popular dance from Istanbul with interaction between the Greeks and the Moldavians, right? So that's fundamental everywhere in the whether it was klezmer music.
I mean, it occurs to me that klezmer evolved in much the way Jewish folktales evolved, integrating and changing accordingly. But I have a couple of questions for you. The first is, how did crises such as the Holocaust or pogroms or any kind of political shifts, did it have an effect on the actual music itself?
I doubt it. Mm-hmm. People were killed, people were displaced, but the music didn't develop in those crisis situations. The music developed in long periods of prosperity and peace.
Interesting.
Which you can also see in the now destroyed synagogue painting in Poland, Lithuania. There were also guilds of synagogue painters, and this really flourished in the 17th and 18th centuries. And the people who study this stress that these are periods of prosperity and peace.
But obviously the music evolved, including different wind instruments that might have been added or subtracted and this and that. What causes klezmer or any kind of music for that matter over time to evolve and change? What would some of the driving forces be?
Well, look, this is an oral tradition with very few written documents up until the late 19th century and early 20th century. So it's very speculative.
Right.
I talk a little bit about evolution because I think we have enough documents to say certain things. As far as instrumentation, we know that very well because the guild documents show that certainly since the 17th century, the instrumentation was fixed everywhere that Klezmer played. It was
Mhm.
based on the first violin, on the second violin accompanying him, and on the cymbal, which is my instrument, which is it's called cymbalom in Hungarian. You know what I'm referring to. It's a dulcimer struck with hammers,
Okay.
which the Jews were very important in developing in Eastern Europe.
Really?
Oh yes, oh yes. Basically the two long traditions of cymbal playing in Europe are the Jewish and the Hungarian.
Well,
Probably the Jewish is a bit older, and they interacted with each other. But when I started to play the cymbal, and actually, I should add, after the Shoah, I was actually pretty much the first Jewish performer playing Jewish music, learning the instrument.
as
And
you're talking, you're doing the swaying of a cantor.
I don't mean
I
to.
know it's
Sorry.
very interesting. I love it. Um, is this am I crazy? I was in Lisbon and I went to hear fado music and I kept saying, this sounds a little klezmery to me. I mean, is there some influence that got into the Portuguese tradition or?
Not directly, but there are things shared, coming from the Arabs, coming from the Mediterranean mixture. And
Okay.
again, even though our people were living very far to the north and very far from the Mediterranean, certain parts of our culture were inextricably linked with the Mediterranean, of
Mhm.
which, by the way, the gesture that you began to
Yeah.
speak about, that's fundamental.
Well, talk to me about that because I don't, the gesture is fundamental in the playing of the music or in the,
Yes, it's a link between the language, the posture, of Yiddish speakers, and the dance and the music.
can you elaborate on that a bit?
Well, it's again, I knew this instinctively, but I could never articulate it until around, I guess, 2008. I was teaching a course in Jewish performance at NYU for Barbara Kirschel-Bad Gimlet when she was in Poland. She asked me to teach her course, and she helped me to discover the early research about Yiddish gesture done by David Efron, who studied here at Columbia, actually, in the 30s. And his book, Gesture, Race, and Culture, was fundamental, defining speech gesture, basically. He was one of the pioneers in defining speech gesture. And later on, I mean, many decades later, musicologists began picking up on the concepts of speech gesture and seeing its relevance to music, first of all, in Western music.
I just have to stop you. I don't think I understand what you mean when you say speech gesture.
Okay, now, actually, after I went to NYU Abu Dhabi and taught there, I discovered that almost all my students were coming from the Arab countries, from Africa, and from India. And uh, all of their languages were very rich in fundamental movements that accompanied their conversation in their language, whether it was Amharic or Arabic or Malayalam. And and then, of course, I created a course called Gesture, which is they started reading David Efron about Yiddish gesture. They read Quintilian's Latin book in translation on the art of the orator, which has a chapter on gestus, and gesture in ancient Rome. And it was pretty clear. I taught it for 3 years. It was pretty clear that the use of gestures in speaking the Yiddish language properly. And again, since I come from a Yiddish-speaking home, this is natural for me. Most people who speak Yiddish do not learn it in this way anymore, which is very unfortunate. But to speak Yiddish properly, just as to speak Arabic properly or to speak Amharic properly, you use your head, you use your hands, you use your shoulders, Everything is going at the same time. And as I learned, the ancient Greeks and Romans thought this was fundamental. That an orator who's speaking either in a court case or politically, he has to learn how to make his point, tone of voice, facial gestures, posture, hand gestures, all this was connected. So 2,000 years ago, there was already a discourse. This
I
is
mean,
not,
before we had the written word where we could do an exclamation mark or a period.
even people who had the written word, that one,
Mm,
one doesn't connect the other, that doesn't
mm,
contradict the other.
mm.
And actually, as I studied biology and psychology, and I had the help of an evolutionary biologist at NYU who was interested in my work, um, speech gesture was probably much older than language. And the
Of
more
course.
recent
Yeah.
research suggests that once, let's say, people had the ability to move our hands and gesture thousands of years before our vocal cords had evolved to the point that we could control the sounds that we were emitting.
You've really helped go a long way to explain my mother's very, very favorite expression, which is
Of course, of course.
Hungarian. Yeah.
Yeah, but again, that's called symbolic gesture, which
Okay.
which is not typical of the Yiddish language, nor
Oh,
of Greek, nor of Latin. No, it's a peasant movement.
oh,
In
she
fact,
won't like that.
you wouldn't like that. Quintilian specifically tells his students, "Don't do that." That's what the peasants do.
And so when I've been watching Klezmer, though I've never noticed gesture, maybe I just wasn't watching. Can you connect it
Not
to?
visible. No, it's audible. It's audible. You again, you have to understand the structure of the music.
Okay.
That's why I'm glad that for the last, I don't know, 20 something years or so, Western musicologists are working in gesture. Gesture, from Renaissance music and into Baroque music.
Well, but I'm feeling like a little bit of an idiot now because I'm still trying to understand what an audible gesture would be in Klezmer.
Well, it's a question of in any music that, um, I mean, gesture is a deep topic, and I'm glad that it's very recently become very much developed and explored. Um, let's say from, again, I'm not a biologist or a psychologist. From what I do in reading their work, the brain has different centers, and certain parts of the brain, say, respond to repetitive rhythm. For example, talking about music, responds to repetitive rhythm, which entrains the whole body. And we respond usually by dancing and by shaking our bodies and so forth. And this is from the cerebellum. This is in the lower brain, and that it's very connected with movement. So certain musical cultures very much base themselves on what they call motor rhythm that entrains the body. Other musical cultures develop a musical expression that's closer to the idea of speech, which is coming from another part of the brain entirely, and which is not controlled by the motor rhythm. So it tends to flow more. And of course, in Jewish culture, davening, the idea is that the davening is never controlled by a motor rhythm.
So when you say gesture, it would be in the way, I mean, I'm just trying to break this down for myself and some listeners. Let's say you're starting a concert. It would be in the sort of davening like way you might play a note.
No, no,
No.
no, not that might occur sometimes, but it's not only that. It's really the connection between sections of a melody, the way rhythm is phrased.
Okay.
And again, this is a big difference between the European tradition of classical music and what developed in America.
Okay.
As the Americans, let's say, there was more emphasis on the motor rhythm here than there had been.
Interesting. Was that an influence of the Christian?
No, not at all. It's actually another theme, which I didn't get to, which is the theme of the importance of historical Moldova.
Okay, go on.
Okay? Because only in historical Moldova, under the Ottoman rule, mainly in the 18th century, that we had the two professional castes, the Klezmer Jews and the Lautar Roma, who were working together, which occurred only in that part of Europe, only under the Turkish rule in Moldova, nowhere else. There may have been some of this also in Hungary after the Turks left. It's possible, but it hasn't been. My wife, Judith Frigashi, is both a great expert on Davonen and has written brilliant things on Davonen. And also she's written a little bit about this connection of the Hungarian Roma gypsies and the Klezmorim, but it came to an end in Hungary already by the early 19th century. But in Moldova, it went on from the 18th through the 19th into the 20th century. And as I mentioned, my teacher, Dave Taras, had studied there. So this, already by the later 19th century, after the Turks had left Moldova, there was a kind of development of a native music for the what we call the Romanians now, the Moldavians and the Wallachians, in which the Klezmorim had a role, the Lautar Roma had a role, the Greeks had a role, Austrian musicians had a role, and this was a new kind of fusion music that the Jews in most countries actually liked this, and so it diffused very far from Moldova. It's not co-territorial. It wasn't something that only the local Jews liked.
And I wonder, when you play klezmer and dance, is it a kind of wonderful release from thinking? Like, in other words, are you able to have emotional abandon without your enormous?
Well, sorry, actually, our dancing is a very introverted dancing. And I guess I should mention that in Jewish dance, there are two basic categories. There's the communal dance, which are circles and lines, and sometimes contra dancing, which came from England originally, Englischer Tanz, which in Yiddish we call share, which is again a term known everywhere in Eastern Europe by the Jews. And this is where you change partners, because the rabbis didn't like the idea of men and women dancing together. But if you change partners, that's not so terrible. Okay? But the other style of dancing was the dance of the tenser. The tenser meaning a solo dancer. And the East European Jews appreciated a virtuosic and expressive dancer. And it seems that the Ashkenazim seem to be the only Jewish culture that developed a very distinctive form of dance. The only close, let's say, somewhat relatives are probably the Yemeni Jews, which is also a gestural dance, and the Bukharian Jewish women who had a professional dance, of what's called sazan, that professional women dancer. But we don't have enough study of the gestural language of neither of the Yemeni Jews nor of the Bukharians. But I've observed some of that, yeah.
I was curious when I was listening to you if there is an equivalent in contemporary New York culture that mirrors I'm not saying that it is klezmer, but I'm saying, is there like a parallel dance that's emerging that you see similarities in? Not dance, I'm sorry, musical form. Is there a way to compare klezmer to some sort of contemporary musical form?
I'm not aware of that. Again, I'm not aware of that at all. What I was trying to suggest was that because of this contact of the older klezmer with the newer style emerging in Moldova, there were then links between Romanians, also in Greeks, because remember the Greeks had ruled Moldova for a long time. And the musicians were going to Istanbul every year from Moldova. We have documents of this, going and coming back. And so this newer music that developed in the second half of the 19th century came to America with the immigration, both of the Jews and of the Greeks. And they influenced one another in America, especially in New York, to some extent in Philadelphia. And this has very little study about this. I mean, I grew up in this environment because, again, my musical teachers, some of them were Greeks, both Greek immigrants and Greek American enthusiasts. I was in a Greek band when I was a teenager. I was playing. So, and I knew that the Greeks knew the great klezmer musicians. Dave Taras, Naftali Bratman, they were known to the Greeks. So this was let's say, the actual interaction. I'm not aware that it's, let's say that there was, again, there were very strict borders between the different ethnic groups.
Although it really is exciting to think about how it might continue to evolve. I mean, why do you think klezmer music is just more popular than ever now?
Well, I'm gratified to see it. I'm the artistic director of the Klezmer Institute. That's a very new organization, working with Christina Crowder and Clara Boehm. Um, Again, I should probably send you. Back in 2003, I think we had a little program at the Graduate Center in CUNY called the Revival of Klezmer and Yiddish Music, New York, 1975 to 2002, which I organized along with Steve Blum, who's a professor there. And the fact is that the music was very strong in America. I mean, in New York and in Philadelphia and a few other cities from the 1880s up until, let's say, the early 60s or something. And there was a break when, after the news of the Shoah and then the creation of the State of Israel. And, there were several factors that my generation of Jews usually were less interested.
Okay.
Okay. So I grew up in this strange situation where, since my parents were immigrants and I was exposed to the Landsmannschaft organizations and all this living culture, living dance and living music, I knew it was alive, but almost everybody else of my generation knew nothing about it.
Yeah.
So that's where I eventually came in with my friend Andy Statman, who we were playing together in Armenian music and Greek music, and eventually we started working with Taras and learning the Jewish klezmer music. And I thought it was just our own little hobby. And I was really shocked. We got an NEA grant, and we put through the Center for Traditional Music and Dance, we put Taras on stage in 1978, and all hell broke loose. I mean, I wrote an article about that. It was just pandemonium. There was so much enthusiasm for rediscovering this music.
Yeah. I mean,
yeah.
I think it's emotional. I think that's why. I think it really brings out something that's beyond an intellect. It brings out something very primitive and heartfelt in me, certainly, and I assume in other people. So it's a beautiful thing.
For sure. And again, at a certain point, I became aware of its appeal, let's say, outside the Jewish community, that which was pretty early, that especially with the unification of Germany after the fall of the Soviet system,
Yeah.
that was a very important factor. And without the Germans, I doubt that the Klezmer Revival could have succeeded as well.
Why?
Well, the klezmatics would tell you that too. I mean, I know them, Frank London and Nisha Spiegels and stuff. That when they first went to Germany, my impression was that the German audience and the producers wanted to hear something more authentic. They were looking for something that was really more reflective of the European Jewish tradition, not only the new movements in America. Because again, the klezmer music had been almost moribund, not for very long, for 10, 15 years, where there wasn't much development.
Wow.
So the Germans were a musically sensitive and affluent audience. And actually, I left klezmer music after about 10 years. I could see, let's say in the early 80s, it still had a very small audience and a very limited group, only among Jews for the most part. And, it was less exciting for me. I worked in Turkey, I was working with Ottoman music, but then I began to see by the late 80s, 90s, that there was a new configuration. And in a way, I regretted that I dropped out, but by the mid '90s and later '90s, I was coming back because it had become much more interesting.
Yeah.
Far more international. Far more international.
Zev, I feel like we're just hitting the tip of the iceberg, but before we close, what are you working on now?
Oh, well, I just finished a little article about dance, about Ashkenaz dance, solo dance mainly, for a collection that's coming out soon called Tanz. There's several projects. I mean, I would like to do a book about the Moldavian Jewish tradition, which I'm planning. I'm also sort of halfway done with a book called The Elusive Klezmer, which is, let's say, a shorter and more direct and more personal version of what I have in the big book, the Klezmer Music History and Memory. That's just for starters.
So you have so much to offer, and I'm going to look forward to fangirling you and keeping up with all that you're up to. And I'm never going to be able to listen to Klezmer the same again. And I really want to thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today. It's a wonderful start to getting us thinking about things in a totally different way. So
thank you. Thank you very much. I enjoyed it as well.
I am too. And I wish you all the best.
Thank you.
Thanks, Zev.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.